In 1961, the massive ultra-electric factory on Western Avenue in Acton, London, ceased to be an independent British radio maker. Thorn Electrical Industries acquired the company's television and radio manufacturing arm for $2.4 million, instantly reducing a proud, innovative wireless brand to a mere badge engineered onto a shared, mass-produced chassis. The famous Art Deco cabinets and distinct tuning dials began to vanish from independent high street shop windows. Assembly workers in Acton saw their production lines absorbed into a massive corporate machine, whilst local service engineers suddenly found identical printed circuit boards inside supposedly rival sets. A decade earlier, the Ultra name on a glowing dial had meant the exact opposite. It was a symbol of striking independent design, a trusted centerpiece in the British sitting room for the coronation, and a guarantee of bespoke domestic engineering. But the real story of Ultra Radio is not only the story of its absorption by Thorn, it is the story of how an independent British wireless pioneer that mastered the aesthetics of the valve age could not survive the ruthless manufacturing costs and corporate consolidation of the mid-century consumer market. Every week, we tell the stories of British wireless makers, high street shops, and listening habits that shaped how the country heard the world, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if this history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In London, in 1920. In the early 1920s, the British wireless experience was rarely a shared domestic event. Before the British Broadcasting Company had fully established its monopoly on the national imagination, listening to broadcast signals was a solitary, expensive, and often physically messy undertaking. The typical household setup was not a polished wooden cabinet sitting elegantly on a sitting room sideboard. Instead, the early British wireless enthusiast hovered over a rudimentary receiver, adjusting a fragile crystal set, or tending to early glowing valves, glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals before the transistor era. These early valve radios were not simply plugged into the wall. They required heavy, dangerous glass accumulators, rechargeable lead-acid batteries that powered the valve filaments. These accumulators leaked, they emitted noxious fumes, and they had to be carried carefully down the high street to the local garage or electrical shop every week to be recharged. Worse still, the sound they produced was often remarkably faint. Families did not gather across the room to listen to distant transmissions. Instead, individuals took turns clamping heavy, uncomfortable headphones over their ears to catch the crackle of voices from early transmitters like the 2LO station in London. What the British domestic market lacked was volume, reliability, and cleanliness. If the wireless was ever to become a permanent, universally accepted fixture in the family home, it had to stop behaving like a piece of hazardous laboratory equipment. It had to start functioning like a piece of polite household furniture. It was into this specific gap that a London engineer named Edward Rosen stepped in 1920. Rosen did not begin his business by building complete wireless sets. He understood that the immediate bottleneck in British radio reception was not merely catching the signal from the air, but actually hearing it clearly in a domestic space. He founded Ultra Electric Limited with a specific focus on manufacturing high-quality headphones and loudspeakers, the vital mechanical parts of a radio that turn the electrical signal into physical sound moving through the air. By dramatically improving the acoustic output of early receivers, Rosen allowed listeners to finally put down their headphones. A single broadcast could now fill a room, turning radio from a private, isolated hobby into a communal domestic ritual. But Rosen's ambition extended far beyond the speaker grill. As the 1920s progressed and the BBC expanded its network of regional transmitters and long-wave broadcasts from Daventry, the public demand for complete, reliable home receivers surged. Ultra Electric shifted its manufacturing focus from peripheral audio accessories to building the entire machine. To meet this escalating demand, the company required industrial scale. Ultra established its manufacturing base in West London, eventually constructing a massive purpose-built facility on Western Avenue in Acton. This factory would become the beating industrial heart of the Ultra empire. It was here that Rosen's engineers tackled the most pressing problem of the era: eliminating the dreaded acid accumulator from the British sitting room. The ultimate solution was the mains radio, a wireless set designed to be plugged directly into the standard household electrical supply, drawing alternating current straight from the grid, rather than relying on heavy, leaking batteries. This was a technological leap that fundamentally changed the geography of the British home. A mains radio could be placed on a mantelpiece or a dedicated side table and left there permanently. It required no chemical maintenance, only the occasional replacement of a blown valve or a faded tuning dial. The illuminated scale or display that visually showed which station or frequency the radio was tuned to. When Ultra's early mains receivers began appearing in British high-street electrical shops and local independent radio dealers, they were by no means cheap commodities. Surviving industry records suggest that a high-quality mains valve radio in the late 1920s and early 1930s could easily cost upwards of $15. In an era when the average weekly wage for a manual worker was roughly £3 to £4, an Ultra wireless set represented a massive domestic financial investment. It was often the second most expensive item in the household, surpassed in value only by the family piano or a heavy three-piece suite. Because of this immense retail cost, the radio had to look the part. An Ultra set could not resemble a crude scientific instrument patched together with exposed wires. It had to feature polished wood veneers, intricate speaker grills, and an imposing architectural physical presence. The Acton factory began producing beautifully finished cabinets that justified the high price tag, turning the wireless receiver into a coveted status symbol. The British entry of the Ultra brand was cemented not just by the technology wired inside the cabinet, but by the distribution network built outside of it. Ultra radios were heavily promoted in early hobbyist magazines, like Practical Wireless, featured in mail-order catalogs, and proudly displayed by high-street dealers who offered crucial installation and repair services. When a family purchased an early Ultra receiver, the local service engineer would visit the home to install the outdoor aerial, a long stretch of wire suspended above the garden to physically catch radio waves from the air, and ensure the set was properly calibrated to receive the BBC national and regional programs. By the early 1930s, the name Ultra was no longer just associated with standalone loudspeakers. It was a recognized mark in the rapidly expanding British radio industry. The Western Avenue factory in Acton was employing hundreds of local workers, stamping out metal chassis, soldering complex wiring circuits, and assembling heavy wooden cabinets. Edward Rosen had successfully taken a modest London company that started with simple headphones and transformed it into a fully integrated manufacturer of premium domestic wireless sets. The gap in the market had been comprehensively filled. The acid batteries were finally banished from the sitting room carpet. The BBC had been given a clear, loud, and reliable voice. And on the high street, the Ultra badge was beginning to establish a distinct promise of reception, paving the way for a decade of bold, unforgettable design that would define the brand's imminent golden era. By the early 1930s, the British wireless market had undergone a fundamental shift. Listeners no longer wanted generic utilitarian boxes of wires. They demanded branded identities and domestic elegance. Ultra Electric responded to this cultural shift by launching a series of premium receivers named after wild animals, most notably the Ultra Tiger, the Panther, and the Lynx. This was a deliberate and aggressive marketing strategy designed to convey power, reach, and precision to the British consumer. When a buyer walked into a high-street electrical shop, they were not just buying a machine, they were purchasing an Ultra Tiger. The physical presence of these receivers was striking. The Ultra Tiger, introduced in the early 1930s, was not a modest wooden square easily hidden in a corner. It featured a bold, heavily stylized Art Deco cabinet, the wooden, plastic, or bakelite body that holds the radio's components and shapes its appearance. It possessed an imposing, almost architectural authority on the sitting room sideboard. It often featured a distinctive clock-face tuning dial, framed in polished chrome or contrasting wood veneers, sitting above a beautifully fretted speaker grille. Inside the cabinet, the Tiger and the Panther represented a significant engineering leap for the Acton factory. These sets utilized a super-heterodyne circuit, a highly advanced tuning system that mixed the incoming broadcast signal with a locally generated frequency to vastly improve selectivity. How well a radio separates one station from nearby stations. As the BBC aggressively added more regional transmitters and powerful European commercial stations like Radio Luxembourg began crowding the medium wave, the broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, this selectivity was no longer an expensive luxury. It was an absolute necessity for frustration-free listening. The circuit relied on a series of specialized internal valves, glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals before transistors replaced them. Operating an Ultra Tiger was a deliberate tactile ritual. When the set was switched on at the wall, the listener had to wait. The valves required a full minute to warm up, their glass envelopes glowing a dull, comforting orange through the ventilation slots in the back panel. Only when the internal temperature was reached would the dial lamp fully illuminate, casting a warm light across the station names printed on the glass. Then, a rich, heavy sound would begin to push through the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air. This level of domestic engineering and high-end cabinetry was not cheap. Surviving records suggest that an Ultra Panther could easily retail for around 15 to 18 guineas. In an era where a skilled factory worker might earn £3 or £4 a week, buying a premium Ultra receiver outright was a massive financial hurdle. But the 1930s saw the rapid expansion of hire purchase, a financial arrangement where British families paid a deposit and a weekly sum to a local radio dealer. This system allowed working-class and middle-class households to put a state-of-the-art Ultra receiver in their front room immediately, paying for the technology in shillings while listening to the BBC national programme. Ultra's true breakthrough, however, was not just the circuit design. It was the manufacturing moat they built in West London. Ultra did not simply assemble bought-in parts. The massive Western Avenue factory in Acton integrated almost the entire production process under one roof. They wound their own heavy mains transformers. They built their own tuning capacitors, components that change the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many. They stamped their own metal chassis and crafted their own wooden cabinets. This total vertical integration allowed Ultra to strictly control the quality of every component that left the factory gates. Because the radios were immensely reliable, independent high-street radio shops and local service agents aggressively stocked them. A local dealer knew that an Ultra set would not bounce back to their repair counter within a month. The sets were prominently displayed in shop windows across Britain, from Curry's branches to independent electrical retailers, often serving as the flagship model to draw customers through the door. The enthusiast press immediately recognized this rigorous standard. Influential magazines like Wireless World and Practical Wireless praised Ultra receivers for their robust construction and exceptional tone control, the control that changes the balance of bass and treble to suit the acoustic properties of a specific sitting room. An Ultra was widely considered a serious listener's set, capable of pulling in faint, distant signals from across the continent on short wave, a broadcast band that can carry signals over long distances, while delivering local BBC broadcasts with absolute clarity and warmth. By 1935, Edward Rosen's company had firmly established its place in the British home. The animal-themed radios had cemented Ultra's identity as a maker of powerful, beautifully designed, and highly engineered domestic appliances. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By the late 1940s, the Ultra Electric factory on Western Avenue in Acton was no longer just a workshop. It was an industrial fortress of British domestic electronics. The scale of production had shifted entirely from the bespoke craftsmanship of the early 1920s to a relentless, highly organized assembly line. Hundreds of local workers streamed through the factory gates every morning, their days measured by the rhythmic stamping of metal chassis, the intricate winding of copper coils, and the careful hand-soldering of valve sockets. Edward Rosen's company had survived the grim austerity of the Second World War, during which the Acton plant had been heavily repurposed to build vital aircraft intercoms, radar components, and military communication equipment, and emerged into the post-war era with its engineering reputation not only intact, but vastly enhanced. This wartime discipline translated directly into the post-war domestic market. When Britain returned to peacetime broadcasting, the nation's listening habits were fundamentally cemented around two distinct BBC services: the Home Service, which provided news, drama, and trusted national information, and the Light program, which offered lighter entertainment and music. Ultra radios were precisely engineered to receive these services with unshakable reliability. The brightly illuminated tuning dials of post-war Ultra sets read like a map of the recovering continent, listing not just London, the regional transmitters, and Droitwich, the massive transmitting station that sent long-wave signals across the entire country, but also Hilversum, Paris, and Athlone. The distribution network that carried these radios into British homes was equally vast. Ultra did not rely solely on premium department stores. Their strength lay in the bustling British high street. The radios were prominently featured in mail-order catalogues and proudly stocked by major national chains like Currys. Crucially, they were also the lifeblood of thousands of independent radio dealers and local electrical shops from Glasgow to Southend-on-Sea. These local shops were more than just retail outlets. They were community service hubs. An Ultra radio sitting in the window of a local high street dealer was a recognized signal of quality. Customers knew that if they committed their wages to an Ultra set, the shop owner would deliver it in a van, ensure the outdoor aerial was correctly rigged to the chimney, and return to test the valves on a repair bench if the reception ever faltered. Industry estimates suggest that during its peak in the early to mid-1950s, Ultra was producing tens of thousands of receivers annually, pushing them out through a dedicated dealer network that blanketed the United Kingdom. The brand had successfully navigated the transition from the heavy, dark wooden cabinets of the 1930s into the brighter, more modern aesthetics of the 1950s. The Acton factory began incorporating early plastics, refined bakelite moldings, and lighter, sleeker wood veneers. They created table radios, radios designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, that perfectly matched the hopeful, modernizing mood of post-war British interior design. They also expanded into building magnificent radiograms, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one substantial cabinet that dominated the front rooms of aspirational households. The definitive cultural moment for this era of Ultra's dominance arrived in June 1953 with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. While this event is often retroactively remembered as the moment television truly arrived in Britain, for millions of households who could not yet afford a television set or did not live within range of the early broadcast transmitters, the wireless remained the primary conduit to the ceremony. Families, neighbors, and friends crowded into sitting rooms across the country, gathering around glowing Ultra sets to listen to Richard Dimbleby's hushed, reverent commentary broadcast from Westminster Abbey. The radio was not background noise. It was the absolute focal point of the room, trusted to deliver a momentous national event without a single crackle of interference. Unwanted noise or disturbance added to the broadcast signal. In these moments, an Ultra receiver ceased to be merely a collection of glass valves, tuning capacitors, and printed dials. It became an interface with the nation itself. The success of the coronation broadcasts propelled Ultra into its most profitable decade. The Western Avenue facility expanded into a sprawling, self-contained industrial village. By the mid-1950s, the factory employed thousands of Londoners. It was a site of immense civic pride and economic gravity, complete with its own social clubs, canteens, and a fleet of delivery vans that carried the distinctive Ultra logo out onto the arterial roads of Britain. These vans supplied a network of over 4,000 independent electrical retailers. From the bustling windows of Dixon's to the quiet, dusty shelves of village radio shops in Yorkshire, the Ultra brand stood shoulder to shoulder with formidable domestic rivals like Bush, Murphy, and Pye. During this period, the nature of British broadcasting underwent a profound technological upgrade. To combat the severe signal crowding and electrical interference on the medium-wave band, the BBC began transmitting on VHF-FM, a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands. This required entirely new receiver designs. Ultra's engineering teams in Acton responded by designing sophisticated valve circuits that could capture these new high-fidelity signals. The tuning dials of late 1950s Ultra sets grew more complex, incorporating the VHF band to deliver the home service, the light program, and the culturally demanding third program, with a clarity that older pre-war radios simply could not achieve. Simultaneously, the physical geography of the British radio was changing. The wireless was no longer confined to a single, massive wooden cabinet in the primary sitting room. As post-war wages rose, households began purchasing second sets for other spaces. Ultra capitalized on this shift by producing highly successful, compact table models, such as the famous Ultra Troubadour series. Housed in sleek, cream-colored or brown early plastic cabinets, these smaller radios were explicitly designed for the bedside table or the kitchen counter. They were light enough to be moved, yet powerful enough to pull in the morning news over the sound of a boiling kettle. While the small Troubadour conquered the kitchen, Ultra's premium radiograms dominated the aspirational front room. A radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one substantial cabinet, was the ultimate status symbol of the 1950s. Ultra crafted these massive units with rich walnut veneers featuring heavy wooden lids that lifted to reveal gleaming Garrard record decks alongside beautifully illuminated radio scales. These were not just electronics. They were the focal point of weekend family entertainment, pumping out both the latest vinyl records and the Saturday night variety broadcasts with a deep, resonant warmth. To maintain this massive output across both small kitchen sets and large furniture pieces, the Acton factory began adopting new, faster manufacturing techniques. The painstaking, point-to-point hand wiring of the 1930s was gradually replaced by the printed circuit board, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them. This allowed Ultra to produce radios at a volume that could satisfy the insatiable high-street demand. Yet, despite these modern mass production methods, the company strictly maintained its commitment to the local repairer. Every Ultra radio was issued with a comprehensive, highly detailed service manual. The local high-street dealer was not merely a point of sale, they were an authorized service agent. If a dial lamp failed, a tuning capacitor jammed, or a valve lost its emission, the set was carried back to the shop, placed on a familiar repair bench, and fixed by an engineer who understood the Acton circuitry intimately. This was the zenith of the British wireless ecosystem. It was an era when domestic electronics were built to be serviced, sold by people who understood them, and expected to last for a generation. By 1959, an Ultra radio was an established, unquestioned fixture of British domestic life. Sitting on a polished sitting room sideboard in Bristol, or resting quietly on a kitchen shelf in Manchester, its glowing dial represented a perfect alignment of trusted local engineering, reliable high-street retail, and the daily rhythm of BBC broadcasting. It was a physical promise that the voices in the air would always be caught, amplified, and delivered with clarity into the home. But this entire system relied heavily on the premise that British buyers would always be willing to pay a premium for a heavy, domestically manufactured wooden cabinet and a complex, hand-assembled circuit, an assumption that the impending transistor revolution and ruthless corporate cost-cutting were about to shatter. By the dawn of the 1960s, the massive Western Avenue factory in Acton still hummed with the daily rhythm of thousands of workers, but the foundation beneath the British domestic electronics industry was fracturing. The golden age of the heavy, mains-powered valve radio was coming to a rapid, unforgiving end. The decline of Ultra radio was not caused by a sudden collapse in engineering standards or a failure of imagination. It was the result of overlapping structural market forces that systematically dismantled the economic logic of independent British radio manufacturing. The first decisive blow was a fundamental technological and listening culture shift. Throughout the 1950s, the sitting room had been steadily conquered by television, relegating the radio to secondary spaces like the kitchen, the bedroom, or the garden shed. To survive outside the sitting room, radios had to become smaller, lighter, and completely untethered from the household electrical grid. This demand accelerated the rapid adoption of the transistor, a small electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with less heat, less physical bulk, and far less electrical power than a fragile glass valve. A transistor radio could run for months on a single, inexpensive battery. It did not require a heavy mains transformer. It did not need a minute to warm up, and it could be carried to the beach or the park. But for a massive industrial facility like Ultra's Acton plant, this technological miracle was a severe logistical liability. The factory had been painstakingly configured over 3 decades to stamp heavy metal chassis, wind thick copper coils, and assemble large acoustic wooden cabinets. Transitioning an enormous workforce from building substantial domestic furniture to soldering microscopic components onto delicate printed circuit boards required immense capital investment. The British cabinet, valve, component, and skilled labor costs made it increasingly difficult for independent companies like Ultra to produce a portable transistor set that could turn a reliable profit. Simultaneously, the British market faced a relentless wave of imported electronics. Ultra and its domestic rivals suddenly found themselves competing with Japanese transistor radios and cheap Hong Kong imports. These foreign sets did not possess the warm, room-filling acoustic resonance of a classic 1930s Ultra Panther, nor were they housed in beautifully polished walnut veneers. But For a new generation of listeners, that level of domestic engineering no longer mattered. The cheaper radio did not need to last for decades, and it did not need to be serviced by a local engineer. It only needed to find Radio Luxembourg under the bedsheets, or pick up the light program on a picnic blanket. Under the crushing weight of these manufacturing costs and the relentless high-street price pressure, Edward Rosen's independent empire finally buckled. The definitive turning point arrived in May 1961. Thorn Electrical Industries, a massive and aggressively expanding British corporate conglomerate led by Sir Jules Thorn, acquired Ultra's entire radio and television manufacturing arm for $2.4 million. Overnight, a proud, pioneering London wireless maker ceased to be an independent entity. The acquisition was not a merger of equals. It was a total corporate absorption. Thorn did not purchase Ultra to preserve its unique approach to acoustic design or its bespoke valve circuitry. They bought the brand name, the massive Acton factory capacity, and, most importantly, Ultra's established network of loyal high-street dealers and rental chains. Almost immediately, the retreat of the true Ultra radio began. The sprawling Western Avenue facility, once the proud, independent heart of the company, was rapidly integrated into the vast British Radio Corporation, BRC machine, the umbrella organization Thorn used to manage its growing portfolio of swallowed competitors, which already included Ferguson and would soon include Marconi Phone and HMV. The most devastating consequence of this corporate consolidation was the introduction of badge engineering, the widespread manufacturing practice of building a single, standardized internal chassis and selling it under several different brand names by merely changing the plastic outer case or the metal logo. For the British listener and the high-street repairer, the illusion faded quickly. A customer could walk into a local radio shop in 1963, ask for a new Ultra Portable, and carry it home, trusting the name on the grill. But when that set eventually developed a fault and was taken back to the service counter, the deception was laid bare. The local service engineer would unscrew the back panel, place the set on the repair bench, and find the exact same printed circuit board, the same tuning capacitor, and the same cheap loudspeaker that sat inside a standard Ferguson model. The unique Ultra identity, the robust mains transformers, the exceptional tone control, and the deeply integrated Acton engineering had been quietly stripped away. The badge remained, but the promise of reception and bespoke quality had been outsourced to a corporate spreadsheet. The brand was no longer a pioneer of British wireless. It had become just another label waiting to be placed on whatever standard chassis the parent company dictated. Throughout the 1960s, the British Radio Corporation deployed the Ultra name across a bewildering array of consumer electronics, attempting to squeeze the final drops of consumer trust from the mark. The badge was affixed to budget-tier portable transistor radios, cheap record players, and early color televisions. But without the rigorous, independent engineering standards of the old Acton factory backing it up, the name rapidly lost its prestige. The loyal base of British listeners, those who had proudly bought a heavy wooden Panther in the 1930s, or a trusted mains receiver for the coronation, began to notice that a modern Ultra set felt suspiciously lightweight, plasticky, and entirely anonymous. This dilution of the brand coincided perfectly with the third structural force destroying the British domestic radio industry: the ruthless transformation of high-street retail. For decades, Ultra had relied upon the independent local radio dealer. These small, technically proficient shops provided a vital buffer between the manufacturer and the listener. If a set had a minor fault, the local engineer fixed it on the repair bench, protecting the brand's reputation. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, this entire ecosystem was being dismantled. The British high street was increasingly dominated by massive discount electrical chains catalog showrooms like Argos, and large department stores that engaged in aggressive price wars. These new retail giants did not employ skilled service engineers. They did not install outdoor aerials, and they did not offer a friendly repair counter at the back of the shop. They operated on a model of rapid turnover and replacement. In this brutal new retail environment, the intricate, repairable British radio was a massive commercial liability. The market demanded cheap, sealed, disposable electronics that could be sold in a cardboard box and replaced entirely if they broke. This demand was flawlessly met by the fourth market force, the overwhelming wave of Japanese imports. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, and Sanyo did not just bring cheaper transistor radios to Britain, they brought a fundamentally different philosophy of manufacturing. Their portable sets were heavily miniaturized, brilliantly packaged, and incredibly reliable out of the box. They did not require a warm-up period, they did not feature fragile glass valves, and they certainly did not need a local repairman. As British listening culture shifted again, moving from the massive furniture-style radiograms to compact music centers and hi-fi separates, which were individual audio components like amplifiers and tuners bought separately rather than housed in one large cabinet. The domestic manufacturers were hopelessly outpaced. Japanese electronics looked like the sleek silver future. An ultra-badged record player, hastily assembled by Thorn using shared, cost-cut components, looked like the heavy, compromised past. For the workers at the Western Avenue factory in Acton, this technological and retail shift was devastating. The sprawling industrial village that Edward Rosen had built to dominate the British mains radio market was entirely unsuited to assembling cheap, miniaturized printed circuit boards at the required global scale. The factory space in West London was simply too valuable, and the domestic British labor costs were far too high to justify building budget electronics that could be imported from East Asia for a fraction of the price. Thorn Electrical Industries, operating strictly on corporate logic, began to strip the remaining manufacturing capacity away from the Acton site. Production lines were consolidated, moved to cheaper regional facilities, or outsourced entirely. The skilled cabinet makers, the women who had meticulously hand-soldered the wartime communication equipment, and the engineers who had designed the complex VHF-FM tuning circuits were gradually made redundant. The physical heart of the Ultra Empire was hollowed out, leaving behind nothing but an empty brick shell on an arterial road. By the mid-1970s, the corporate masters at Thorn realized that the Ultra badge no longer served a commercial purpose. It lacked the modern, exotic appeal of the Japanese imports, and thanks to a decade of aggressive badge engineering, it had lost the deep, historic trust of the older British public. It existed in a fatal retail wasteland, too cheap to be respected, yet too British to be exciting. The final retreat was not a dramatic bankruptcy. It was a slow, bureaucratic erasure. The Ultra name simply stopped appearing in the glossy high street brochures. The badge was quietly removed from the shared television chassis. The corporate catalogs dropped the brand. The massive Acton factory gates were finally locked. The heavy metal presses were sold for scrap. The remaining service manuals were thrown into skips. The local repair counters vanished. The high street windows filled with imported silver plastic. The old wooden cabinets gathered dust. The British Wireless went silent. The Ultra badge did not experience a triumphant 21st century resurrection. Unlike Roberts Radio, which successfully navigated the transition into the digital age by leaning heavily into aesthetic nostalgia, or Bush, which survived purely as a licensed name slapped onto imported supermarket electronics, Ultra simply faded into complete corporate obscurity. When Thorn Electrical Industries eventually merged with EMI in the late 1970s to form Thorn EMI, the vast portfolio of legacy radio brands was aggressively rationalized. The Ultra name, having been systematically drained of its unique engineering identity over 15 years of badge engineering, was quietly retired. By the 1980s, it was entirely impossible to buy a new Ultra radio on the British High Street. The brand was dead. However, the physical objects that Edward Rosen's factory built during its golden age refused to disappear. Today, the true legacy of Ultra Electric does not survive in a corporate boardroom or a modern electronics catalog. It survives on the crowded, solder-flecked repair benches of the British vintage wireless community. Across Britain, from private collector rooms to specialist restoration workshops, the heavy wooden cabinets of the 1930s and the sleek table radios of the 1950s are actively preserved. On vintage radio forums, eBay listings, Gumtree advertisements, and at specialist swap meets organized by the British Vintage Wireless Society, an original Ultra Panther or an Ultra Troubadour remains a highly respected find. These sets are rescued from damp lofts, charity shop floors, and estate clearances. They are carried into garden sheds and meticulously dismantled by enthusiasts who understand the exact schematic of the Acton circuitry. The restoration of an Ultra valve radio is a deeply physical act of historical preservation. It involves cleaning decades of accumulated dust from the glass tuning dial, restringing the delicate drive cord that moves the tuning indicator, and patiently replacing dried-out wax paper capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy, which degrade inevitably over half a century. It involves hunting down replacement glass valves from specialist suppliers to ensure the superheterodyne circuit can once again pull a clean signal from the air. This intense dedication exists because an original Ultra radio still provides a listening experience that modern electronics cannot replicate. A smart speaker, a connected device that plays audio through voice commands and online services, is ultimately a passive, invisible appliance. It demands nothing of the user. But an Ultra valve radio demands active participation. It requires the listener to switch it on, wait a full minute for the internal valves to warm up, and then physically turn a heavy bakelite knob, watching the illuminated needle glide across a glass scale printed with the names of distant European cities. It asks the listener to meet the broadcast signal halfway, turning the act of finding a station into a deliberate, tactile domestic ritual. Not because it is old, but because the engineering was designed to make the listener respect the distance the voice had traveled. Yet, the immense industrial infrastructure that made this experience possible has been entirely wiped from the British landscape. If you travel to Western Avenue in Acton today, you will find no monument to Edward Rosen or the thousands of local men and women who built the British domestic wireless industry. The massive, imposing brick factory that once stamped out chassis and polished walnut veneers is gone. The site has been swallowed by the relentless commercial redevelopment of the A40 corridor, replaced by generic modern retail parks, sprawling logistics warehouses, and anonymous office blocks. The physical heart of the Ultra empire has been completely erased, leaving absolutely no trace of the heavy manufacturing that once dominated the local economy. There is, however, a surprise footnote to this erasure. It is rarely found in official company archives or museum displays. Instead, it is frequently discovered by collectors who unscrew the back panel of a surviving 1950s Ultra radiogram. Folded neatly and tucked safely inside the wooden cabinet, resting against the dusty loudspeaker chassis, is often the original yellowed paper service manual. And written in faded pencil across the schematic diagram are the meticulous, handwritten notes of the local high street service engineer from 1956, detailing the exact date a specific valve was replaced or a tuning dial was recalibrated. That fragile piece of paper, and the local high street repair culture it represents, has successfully outlived the massive Acton factory, the corporate conglomerate that bought it, and the retail system that destroyed it. What the story of Ultra reveals is the unforgiving gap between what Britain says it values and what the market ultimately rewards. It highlights a nation that deeply respected robust engineering, domestic permanence, and trusted local service, yet collectively abandoned those principles the moment cheap, disposable imported convenience became available. It is a stark reminder that a standard of quality cannot survive if the economic system that supports it is allowed to collapse. But occasionally, in a quiet room somewhere in Britain, that original standard can still be heard. There is an Ultra Tiger still sitting on a dedicated repair bench, its heavy wooden cabinet polished, its glass valves glowing a warm, steady orange, waiting for a hand to turn the dial and pull one more voice from the air. See you in the next documentary.